The invention of the telephone impacted local, national, and global communications in many ways. The invention of the telephone had a large impact. It made businesses more efficient and it saved money from having to travel back and forth from distant places, and it made transactions able to occur more easily. The invention of the telephone led to instant communications around the world and even led to the internet. The world's communication has been upgraded greatly by Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone at age 29. Alexander Graham Bell is an American inventor and teacher of the deaf. The telephone has come a long way from its beginning. The world's communication has been upgraded greatly by Alexander Graham Bell. The telephone branched off from the idea of the telegraph. A telegraph is a system for transmitting messages from a distance along a wire. The telegraph is a device that uses electrical pulses to transmit coded messages through a wire to a receiver, where the message is then decoded. It cannot carry out voices or other data and relies entirely upon pulse coding for content. The most famous code is the Morse code. The Morse code is one either of two codes used for transmitting messages in which letters of the alphabet and numbers are represented by various sequences of dots and dashes or short and long signals. Alexander Graham Bell's success with the telegraph came as a direct result of his attempts to improve the telephone. However, the next step of communication required an operator to connect a person calling to a receiver. When you called someone, you had to tell the operator who you wished to speak with, and then he or she would connect you to them. In 1878, companies began hiring women. This is because companies thought women behaved better than men. Women have pleasant voices that customers, most of whom were men, would like, and because society did not treat women equally, they would be paid less and supervised more strictly than men. The next type of telephone that came along was the telephone without an operator. Without an operator, your call would go directly to the person you were calling. Without operators, there had to be telephone wires and poles put up so long-distance and short-distance calls were able to be made. The basic principle of the telephone is sound waves. When a person talks into a telephone, the sound waves strike the diaphragm to make it vibrate. The diaphragm vibrates at various speeds depending on the vibrations and air pressure caused by the varying tones of the speaker's voice. The pattern of the sound waves determine the pressure in the diaphragm. This is the first phone conversation between Thomas A. Watson and Alexander Graham Bell. This conversation took place in 1874.
On the evening of March 10, 1876, Bell sat in front of the new transmitter in the back room, which I had made into a laboratory for him on the top floor of number 5 Exeter Place, Boston, and I went down the hall to the front room to listen for the results with a telephone receiver. But as Bell was about to speak into the new instrument, a motion of his arm upset over his clothes a battery jar of acidulated water. In the excitement of the accident, Bell called out to me, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want you." The big mouthpiece picked up his call for help, and I heard every word of it through the receiver at my ear. The new transmitter was better than we had expected.
Following the invention of the telephone, the world had been greatly impacted. For example, local communications were impacted. Before the invention of the telephone, mail was a large part of local communication, mainly because it was the only way of communication years ago. The telephone has bridged the gap between short and long distance communication. Without this extraordinary invention, communication that was quick and reliable would be extremely difficult. The telephone is used in the home, the business, and in education.
The invention of the telephone led to the development of city centers, office buildings, and the concept of an urban worker society.
The need for positions such as messenger boys, telegraphers, and operators became virtually unnecessary. The telephone has provided security and helped in emergency situations. The telephone is both a conqueror and promoter of crime.
For example, some houses display telephone-based alarm systems. With the telephone, we can contact emergency numbers easily. Just as the computer is a library at our fingertips, the first telephone was just as much magic and excitement to us.
The national connections were impacted in many ways. Communication over the telephone broadened the range of people one could interact with. One of these ways was people across the country could communicate without having to send a letter to each other. If you needed to get a message out to a faraway relative, it would take too long to send a letter and wait for a response. With a telephone, you could just pick up the phone and tell the message and be done in a matter of minutes. With the telephone, we are able to make business transactions with people from across the country.
Today's lifestyle would be extremely restricted without the telephone. The telephone has led to creation and destruction of jobs around the country. Clearly, without the telephone, we wouldn't be able to communicate with anyone outside our state, province, or country. Finally, the telephone affected global communications. The invention has changed the pace of business and made the world smaller and more accessible to all. Long-distance relationships became possible with the telephone. The telephone helps keep close bonds with families and communities. If we still had to rely on mail sent through the postal service, then no one would know what was going on in other places in the world until months after it happened. Without the telephone, we probably wouldn't be able to wage wars in different countries well, and any attack on our country would be met with slow relief. National disasters would also not be able to get quick aid. This is the first telephone call sent around the world.
Hello? Yes? Hello? Good morning, Mr. Gilbert. Hello, Mr. Miller? Yes. Oh, TG, by the way, which way does my voice go to you around this circuit? West of New York. It comes back to me from the east. Oh, mine goes through San Francisco. Yes, San Francisco, that's Java, Amsterdam, London, and New York. I see. Well, it's certainly quite exciting. I take it this is the longest telephone circuit that's ever been set up in the world. Looks like there's any question about that. Over 23,000 miles, they tell me.
The invention of the telephone changed the way we communicate with people around the world and quickened the process. The invention of the telephone will forever change our lives.